There is a sour stench of inequality and voter suppression in the air of this General Assembly. But when I hear these young people, it lets me know that the fresh winds of democracy are still flowing, and that the spirit of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Canton, and Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass, and Medgar Evers, and Martin King, and Viola Davis still lives and breathes even now in the 21st century. I want to do a little history lesson, a moral history lesson for the media, because it's important that we get this right, and I know how concerned you all are with truth, and I appreciate every one of you. It is important in this moment that we understand that what we are seeing in the People's House is direct disenfranchisement. Say that with me. Say direct disenfranchisement. There is a righteous indignation in my spirit this morning. It's a gnaw in my gut, because when you know history and you see it being repeated in ugly ways, it is bothersome. The tools, Mickey, of white supremacists of the 19th century are being reinstated and brought to life in the 21st century here on 116 West Jones Street. Now, as a historian and theologian, I must say the roles are reversed. In the 19th century, it was the white supremacists of the radical racist Democratic Party trying to undermine the populist Republicans and black fusion politics. Now the roles have reversed, and the Republicans, not the Republicans in office 140 years ago, because this crowd lies every time they say they haven't been in office for 140 years. They're still not in office. Those were Lincoln Republicans who were pro-voting and pro-voting rights and education. They're not even like the Republicans that voted for the Voting Rights Act in 1965. They're like the one who didn't vote named Strom Thurmond. This crowd is more akin to the radical race-baiting Democrats and later the Dixiecrats of the George Wallace era with a 21st century nuance. I didn't come to play today. They are smoother, media. They are more shrewd than Strom Thurmond and Wallace because they don't use the N-word. They name their efforts voter protection and voter integrity in a shrewd attempt to use a linguistic trick to throw you off. But anybody who knows history, rooted in history, who has talked to those who have lived history, knows what's going on. And here's the lesson. The 15th Amendment to the United States was ratified, young folk, as you all said, in 1870 to protect the suffrage of freedmen after the American Civil War. You can find this in J. Morgan Kushner's book, The Shaping of Southern Politics, Suffrage Restriction and the Establishment of the One-Party South. And then there was a compromise related to a controversial election in 1876. And then the federal government withdrew the forces in the South in 1877. And in 1877, with the troops removed, starting with Georgia's poll tax, white Southern legislators, and this Republican GOP here is all white Southern legislators led by white supremacists committed to disenfranchisement and not democracy. And they created barriers to prevent the voting of blacks and poor whites. Blacks and poor whites. They used it to consolidate their power, and they worked to suppress the black vote and sharply reduced it through changes in voter registration, election procedures, and poll taxes. From 1890 to 1908, starting with Mississippi, conservative Southern white supremacist legislators created new constitutions with new provisions for voter registration that effectively completed disenfranchisement of most blacks and many poor whites. They created a variety of barriers, including requirements for poll taxes, residency requirements, rule variations, literacy and understanding tests that achieve power through selective application against minorities. And for decades, these white supremacists in the South exercised congressional representation derived from a full count of the population, but they disenfranchised several million black and white citizens. Because of this, because of this disenfranchisement, this is what they're trying to do. They ended up comprising a powerful voting bloc in Congress until the mid-20th century. Basically, the South became one-party states. And because of one-party states, and because they disenfranchised voters, and because they were able to control who was in the General Assembly and who was in the House, their persons elected gained seniority, thereby gaining chairmanships of the most important committees in the House of Representatives. And that's why, because of the consolidation of power through voter suppression, they were able to defeat federal legislation against lynching, among many other issues. It was one-party control that many Southern white supremacists achieved, this seniority. And they were able, because of this seniority and because they rigged election, to control power and thereby control legislation, control rules, control budgets, and control the public policy coming out of the State House and the Congress. Historian Kushner says the chief impetus for voting restriction came from the black belt members. He said, in addition to wanting to affirm white supremacy, the planter and business elite were also concerned about voting by lower class and uneducated whites. They disenfranchised these whites as willingly as they deprived blacks of the vote, because they knew that if there was ever an alliance between poor whites and poor whites and blacks, the South would never be the same. This is what this is about, my brothers and sisters in the media. And so everything they did was to undermine the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Now, in North Carolina, we've been here before. In North Carolina in 1894, a coalition of Republicans and populists took control of the North Carolina state legislature. They elected several U.S. representatives through fusion politics. And in 1896, the election of 1896 saw more gains for the fusion coalition. The legislative majority expanded. Republican Daniel Lindsay Russell won the gubernatorial race, and after the election of over 1,000 elected or appointed black officials, including U.S. Congressman George Henry White, to the United States Congress, in response to that broad-based electorate of black and white politicians, it was in 1898 that the radical racist white supremacists attempted to scare white voters away from the Republican populist coalition. And after a bitter race-baiting campaign led by future Senator Fernhall McClendale Simmons, watch these folk now that are writing these laws and didn't want to run for Senate. We've been here before. We've been here before. Fernhall Simmons led the effort to restrict black vote, led the effort to scare white voters from voting with blacks, led the efforts to say that blacks and whites working together was bad, and then he became a future candidate and a winner for Senate. The Raleigh News and Observer editor, Josephus Daniels, was in on it at the time. The North Carolina racists won the 1898 election, and we had the Wilmington riots in 1898. And then when they got power in the 1900s, they used their power to codify white supremacy and more restriction on voting into our state laws. And the leader of that was Charles B. Aycock. And they ran George White, the last African-American born of a slave, who was in the Congress, out of office. And they used trickery from 1900. They adopted in 1900 a constitutional suffrage amendment. What did it do? It lengthened the term of residence before registration. It enacted educational qualification, literacy qualification, made people have to prepay a poll tax, and it exempted from paying the poll tax only those entitled to vote as of January 1867, which would have meant all African Americans. The cumulative effect of this effort nearly 100 years ago meant that black voters in North Carolina, and many poor whites, but mostly black, were completely eliminated from voter rolls during the period from 1896 to 1904. And because of that, the growth of the black middle class slowed down. And within a decade of disenfranchisement, the white supremacist campaign had erased the image of black elected officials from the political landscape of North Carolina. If you know this history, you understand why every North Carolinian ought to be sick to their stomach. Because what we see happening here in this legislature is that Apodaca and Ruccio and Tillis and Berger, McCory, they see the cowardly act of the 5 Supreme Court activists to remove, not VRA, because that's what they wanted to do, but they didn't want to go down in history. So they basically give you the car and remove the keys. And the keys was Section 4. The coverage and the way in which we cover. And they see in this House the removal of Section 4 the same way the white supremacists saw the removal of the federal troops in 1877. Same thing. And if you read history, you'll see the same thing happening in this House after the removal of the troops in 1877 that you are seeing now with the removal of Section 4 in 2013. The only difference is it's got a 21st century twist to it. It's shrewder. It's not as overt. They don't use the N-word. Allowed, they don't use it, Mickey said. But they use it when they write these policies. And I don't know if the media has picked up on it. Last thing I want to say is that they have a section in this bill, Part 58, I think it's all the way to the back. You got to read it, where they want to actually deny subpoena of records. They want what they talk about when they do their redistricting plan to be protected by lawyer-client privilege so that the people of this state don't know what they talked about and the rationale they use to gerrymander the district. This is evil. I haven't used that word anymore much, but that's what it is. And I say that on great moral terms. You say, well, how can you call it evil? Because Isaiah 10, verse 1 says, woe unto them who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. It's just as wrong as when George White was going out of the Congress and he talked about what they had done, and he said, you may think this is the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress, but let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise someday and come again. And he said, these are the words on behalf of an outraged, heartbroken, bruised, and bleeding, but God-fearing people, faithful, industrious, loyal, rising people full of potential. And I read his speech, I'm reminded that today these young folk are telling us we are called to meet the challenge today. We're angry, we're upset, but we've been here before. And we will stand with the same prophetic and moral courage of those before us, because we know that when it comes to serving God, justice with our neighbors means far more to God than simply praying at the beginning of a house section and then passing laws that are contradictory to God's way of justice. We will stand because we believe that justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And we will fight this battle, and we will win. They may have a vote, but we will win this battle because we always have, And you need to understand, we will unleash every lawyer we have to attack what they're doing. We are calling and summoning our preachers, our rabbis, and our priests to once again light pulpits with the fire of justice all across this state. We will organize like we are organizing in the name of our foremothers and our forefathers and those who died and those who cried.